everyone. We're so pleased you could join us for today's webinar hosted by the Division of Extended Education at the University of Manitoba. I'm Karen Wallaschuk and your host for this event. In just a moment, we'll kick off our concluding webinar in our series and have a panel discussion on the future of AI in lifelong education. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories, we acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to moving forward in a partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. For our audience today, you can use the Q&A function to submit any questions you might have. Our goal today is to cover the majority of our discussion and address any questions that arise within the hour. However, if certain topics arise with our panel discussion that warrant further exploration, we may extend that session by just a few minutes. If you're unable to stay for the extra time, rest assured that the webinar will be recorded and available on our website next week. I'd now like to introduce our speakers. Our moderator for today is Dr. Lastra. He's a lifelong learning professional with over 20 years of high-impact experience in higher education. He brings a wealth of knowledge from his more than 7 years in academic administration. Currently, he serves as the president of the Canadian Association for University Continuing Education, where his contributions have made a significant mark both nationally and internationally in university continuing education. Currently on a research study leave, Rod is working with UNESCO as a technical advisor on digital transformation. His work focuses on two critical areas: analyzing labor market trends to enhance higher education programming and exploring the transformative impact of AI on lifelong learning. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Kelly Shiohira, Director for the Global Science of Learning Education Network. As you may recall, Kelly was our first webinar guest back in September and shared her thoughts on how AI has influenced higher education and how we should respond to potential future implications. Kelly is a distinguished strategist and researcher with a specialized focus on educational interventions in low-income environments. Her expertise spans literacy, workforce development, and the integration of AI in educational settings. She's collaborated with global organizations to launch impactful initiatives, including an award-winning Literacy Through Technology program in multiple African languages. Holding master's degrees from the University of Pennsylvania and Rhodes University, Kelly is currently focused on innovative credentialing and improved labor market signaling. She is also actively developing an AI student competency framework in collaboration with UNESCO. Her insights into the role and implications of AI in skills development have found a broad audience through her numerous published articles. Next, I'd like to introduce Ray Schroeder, Distinguished Educator and Senior Fellow at APSEA, the Online and Professional Education Association, as well as Professor Emeritus at University of Illinois Springfield. Ray joined Rod for a conversation in November 23 regarding the revolutionary world of generative AI with a special focus on the transformative potential of ChatGPT. Ray is a nationally respected and connected leader in higher education and online learning. He is a noted speaker, consultant, researcher, and author on topics related to online learning, emerging educational technologies, and technology-enhanced learning. He's received numerous national awards and citations for individual excellence and leadership from many associations and entities, including the Online Learning Consortium, the U.S. Distance Learning Association, the American Journal of Distance Education, the University of Wisconsin, and the University of Illinois. Most recently, Ray received an honorary doctorate of humane letters from the University of Illinois Springfield. And lastly, it's my pleasure to welcome our newest panelist, Lev Gonick, Chief Information Officer at Arizona State University. Lev is an educator, technologist, and smart city architect. He's been teaching, working, and living on the net for more than 25 years. As the Enterprise Chief Information Officer, he leads the design and agile management of all enterprise infrastructure, applications, products, services, and analytics. Lev also chairs the Sun Corridor Network, Arizona's research and education network. Lev has received numerous awards for his leadership and expertise, including recognition by the Orby Awards in 2023 as Arizona's top large enterprise CIO, named as the top 50 educational technology influencers and leaders by EdScoop in 2022. Inside Business Magazine named Lev as one of their Power 100 in 2015. In 2011, Government Technology awarded Lev one of their top 25 doers, dreamers, and drivers in public sector innovation. In the same year, Crane's Business Cleveland named him as one of its 10 difference makers in Northeast Ohio, and Broadband Properties honored him with their Cornerstone Award for using fiber to build an inclusive society and empower individuals. In 2010, he received recognition as Visionary of the Year from Nateo, and Lev was recognized by Computer World as Premier 100 IT Leader and honored by CIO Magazine with a CIO 100 Award. We're so pleased that Kelly and Ray could join us again today, and a special welcome to Lev. I'd now like to pass it over to Rod to start today's conversation.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Lev, for joining us. And thanks everyone who is in attendance for this session. I'd like to begin by actually having a little bit of an overview about where this webinar series came from. This was an endeavor that started well over a year ago, and it really was a way to try to think about how we can provide some degree of communication with respect to AI education and where things are going. I do have to say, though, that as the old saying goes, it takes a village. These efforts are enormous behind the scenes, and I would like to take this moment in time to give a special thanks to Karen Woloschuk, who has been absolutely vital in ensuring that this webinar series has gone off smoothly. I would also like to extend a thank you to our extraordinary marketing team within the Division of Extended Education, as well as Rena, who has been providing support throughout these sessions. So thanks everyone for everything. And also I'd like to thank the participants. I've noticed that many of you have been attending these sessions over and over again. So again, thank you for that. So the real big question that really started this idea was really to assess the developments and implications of AI on learning, education, and society. And as Karen said, this started off last year in September. I actually was reading a book, I have to say, and I read a really interesting chapter in that book, and I thought, this really encapsulates kind of the idea that I had. And I had the great idea of contacting one of the co-authors of that chapter, which happened to be Kelly. So Kelly, agreed to come on board, and on our first discussion, we unpacked the meaning of what is AI, specifically the genesis of where AI has come from, the fact that it's not a new idea, it's something that's been around for decades, and really to talk about the nuances of what generative AI is all about. But the conversation was more than that. The conversation was bracketed around the guidance for Gen AI in education and research, a UNESCO document, and also the work that that Kelly was doing. And so we kind of centered the conversations on AI and creativity, educational equity, empowering personalized and lifelong learning, expanding education access, pedagogy, and also the ever pervasive pitfalls and potentials of AI. This led to our following conversation with Ray in November, where Ray and I were excited to have the conversation because this was days after OpenAI announced their big announcement in terms of their enterprise and their bots going live. So there was a lot to talk about in that session. We discussed in great detail the architecture of what a transformer network looks like and how it works and how it functions. What are the linguistic features of this kind of technology and what it really means in terms of being able to produce content. We focused on things that Ray has specialties in, and kind of talking about AI agents, digital transformation, which Ray has been involved in for decades, assessment and learning, real-time feedback, and again, this idea of personalized learning was something that really became the gravitas of the entire conversation. That led a few months later to a one-on-one conversation with Saul Khan, where we actually explored this idea of personalized learning. And we unpacked the model that Khan Academy is using right now called Khan-Migo, which is a partnership with OpenAI, and really to really talk about what that meant, how that idea came to be. We talked about structured natural pedagogies, the movement within ed and tech that he's been involved in, the Two Sigma problem, but really importantly to talk about guardrails and how you set up kind of an assistant in AI that actually works within specific parameters, and also kind of the impacts on assessments and writing. We spent a great deal of time talking about that. That led to our following conversation with a colleague and an esteemed scholar in the UK, Mike Sharples, who's written quite a bit about cognition and computers and creative writing. We talked about policies that universities are undertaking at the moment, and we unpacked in great detail the frameworks and governance, specifically as they pertain to the EU AI Act and the Russell Group in the UK with respect to its influences on education. And then finally, with respect to ethics, I invited Sophia Noble from UCLA, a scholar there, and Cecil Rosner, an award-winning journalist in Canada, to really talk about their two books and talk about the ethics and the ethical implications of AI and technology. We talked about engineering consent, perceptions of truth, and the amplification of falsehoods, and how technology can play a huge role, specifically in an age or in a year of multiple elections around the world. And we got into a really fun discussion about the Edward Bernays effect and how technology is having an influence on that. So this leads us to this conversation, the tomorrow never knows, and a little bit of a Beatles reference there, but really to talk about future state and talk about what it is that we can begin to think about where the future may hold. And by future, I'm not talking 10 years, that's impossible. I'm talking next couple of months, maybe a year down the road. But before we get into that discussion, I'd like to maybe highlight two recent publications that may frame kind of our discussions in some degree. Shaping the Future of Learning, which was released by the World Economic Forum, and Artificial Intelligence Index Report 2024 that was released by the Human Center for Artificial Intelligence in Stanford. And one of the things that I found really interesting, and something that maybe to get this conversation started, is there was a really interesting pivot point that happened in 2015. And that pivot point had to do with the move in the dominance of academia or universities having the dominance prior to 2015 in this space. Jeff Hinton from the University of Toronto, for example, and there are many other examples, led the race in terms of AI research. And in 2015, something interesting happened. Industry began to take over. And part of that had to do with the scale and magnitude of training these systems, the compute power that was required, the cost, the energy, the time, that in 2015 and beyond, these models became so big and so powerful that industry led in a development of these models, and more importantly, the training of these models became super expensive, right? So, GPT-4 and Gemini, for example, training alone, $100 million, right? So if you think about the cost, if you think about the startup, OpenAI is a startup company. They had a startup fund of $1 billion to get things going. So really, we're talking a magnitude, a difference of what's happening here. And this leads to our conversation where we are going to be talking with our panelists to talk about the global implications of what this means, the trends of things to watch for, and really a case study. And the case study is what Arizona State is doing right now, which I call innovation in action, a partnership with OpenAI and what that could potentially mean. And in terms of not just what like Arizona State is doing, but maybe broader implications in terms of what this could mean for how education and partnerships with industry could begin to reshape and redefine education as we know it. So without further ado, I'm going to be given the panelists 5 minutes each to begin with an opening remark, and I'm going to turn things over to Kelly to start things off.
Thanks, Rod. I think I will pick up on your transforming education comment. I know the last time I was here with you, I talked about the dangers of artificial intelligence for equity and some of the challenges that were likely to emerge as we continue to engage it as societies. But today I'd like to focus a little bit on some of the potential good that AI can help us achieve in one of the areas that I've worked in over the last decade, which is kind of credential mobility and interoperability of credentials. So I have to premise this a bit with an equity lens, and it is about higher education. We know that degrees, particularly higher education degrees, lead to higher employment and wage opportunities. There is, to some extent, a forced scarcity based on number of seats, number of universities, accreditation processes. Opportunities are more limited in vulnerable populations. Degrees and formal certifications sometimes are not recognized across borders, and this is particularly true moving from third world, quote unquote, countries up into kind of the Northern Hemisphere. So this creates a lot of challenges for migrants, for minorities, few opportunities to break cycles of poverty. And so when we talk about universal skills recognition, international skills mobility, the dominance of industry, it's not just in AI creation and training that industry has started to play a bigger role. It's also, frankly, in skilling. And we see that through kind of the proliferation of MOOCs. I was asked with some colleagues a few years ago to do a piece of work on micro-credentials for the UNESCO, ILO, and the World Bank. And one of the first things we had to do was define a micro-credential. And I posited then, and I still maintain, that micro-credentials are how we have always structured education. Chapters or themes within courses, within degrees, is one example. But what is new is that knowledge now comes from anywhere. Micro-credentials are routinely created by individuals inside and outside of academia, industry leaders, NGOs, even governments. And so really what we need now is for new systems of recognition to catch up to kind of the democratization of knowledge that has occurred. Notwithstanding, of course, the fact that there are still access challenges for half the world's population, but we have at least the theoretical possibility of the democratization of knowledge. But what blocks us is siloed skills data, poor interoperability between institutions, and definitions of things like what is a credit hour, what is a credential, what are the frameworks we're measuring qualifications against. And we do have solutions, the recognition of prior learning, credit banks, but they're one-on-one, highly resource-intensive endeavors, as is accreditation of institutions, for example, like when a university is accredited to offer degrees. So this is where I think AI really comes in and could be part of the solution. If we can create, and this is something my colleagues and I are working towards, at least with the UNESCO competency framework for students, we want machine actionable skills data that can be quickly parsed and compared, determination made at scales we've not seen before. We can compare against internationally recognized skills frameworks like ESCO or ONET. And we can, especially with the introduction of large language models, there's a huge potential to expedite so much of the processes we've previously expended huge amounts of efforts on that have prevented us from really achieving skills democratization in the past. So I'm really excited about this potential. Notwithstanding, there are challenges, and I'm sure we'll get into those in the later part of the session. But I think I just wanted to open with something that really may sound quite scary to a number of people working in higher education, because that is part of transformation, is fear. But for those of us who've been working with particularly disadvantaged populations, holds a lot of promise.
Thank you, Kelly. That's fascinating. Ray.
Oh, thank you very much. And what a pleasure to join you again in a webinar as we look at this rapidly evolving technology. I go back to those days of Mosaic and the first web browser, 92, and we went through a period there where we began to look at the way in which the internet might impact higher ed. And we started probably in the 80s, and it took us a bit of time to go through that evolution. Well, I think this is more of a revolution. It's moving much more quickly than we did back in the 20th century. And in fact, you had pointed out that 2015 inflection point. I see that broadly as a move from an emphasis on research to development of products. So research continues, not to say that there's no research going on, but we are in fact deeply into the development of products. And so we're expecting, and much is hanging on the words of GPT-5, which it may not be called that. Perhaps Lev knows, he may not tell us. But nevertheless, there will be a big development upcoming. And we see speculation that it may come as early as the Google I/O event, which is on the 15th of May, because there's this penchant at OpenAI and other companies to kind of one-upmanship. And so when there's a big event at a competitor, that's a prime opportunity to release a new product. I write biweekly columns under the aegis of UPSIA for Inside Higher Education. And several months ago, I did one in which my colleague and co-researcher, Catherine Kirpin, suggested I talk about personal learning assistance and where we may go using this technology. And of course, we're all using for a variety of tasks the chatbots, and we're going to take an important step, I think, toward agency, toward releasing and using agents. But the suggestion being that if we're committed to lifelong learning, that in fact this technology can know us, can know our interests, our background, track what we've done, look at the developments, and provide us, particularly with pedagogical learning experiences, ones in which it helps guide us through the learning as one would expect from a graduate faculty member in a seminar. So, that's something that's on the near horizon. Let me take a quick sip. As we move, it seems that Perplexity has chosen the track of continuing to develop in the Google search engine to become more of a competitor. So not all of the companies engaged in this have initiatives that will be agent-based. But I think that's an important difference. Whereas up to this point, we've been Q&A. You put a question, or a prompt in, a suggestion, a request for information, you get a response. Excuse me, what we will see with agents is, instead of a question, we're looking for an outcome. So we suggest that I would like to create a website that would really relate to the birds of the Midwest and North America, and I'd like it to be comprehensive. So I'd need all of samples of their songs, and I'd like it to compare those songs to what one could do a live recording. And as Captain Picard would say, make it so. And the agent would go out and first plan and then develop the associated technologies, put them in order, get permissions, perhaps come back for questions, but on a much larger project than simply asking, compare the University of Illinois and the University of Manitoba, particularly in our environmental programs. Well, and that's all well and good. I don't think that's going to go away altogether, but this, in fact, is more of having an associate an intelligent associate who is fully up to date with what's going on in technology and other applications and can make it so.
Thank you. Thanks, Ray. That's really interesting, and this really leads us nicely to our next panelist, Lev. Welcome to this discussion, and I would like to maybe ask you to provide kind of a brief summary of what the partnership with Arizona State and OpenAI means. This is the first partnership of its kind with a large university, and Arizona State is renowned to always take the lead when it comes to issues of innovation and technology and education. So from your perspective, what does this move actually signal for everyone?
Well, first, thanks, Rod, and great to see Ray again, and nice to meet you, Kelly, and to everyone who's tuning in. My name is Lev Gonick. I work as the CIO, the Chief Information Officer at Arizona State University in January of this year. We, along with OpenAI, made an agreement to basically forge a long-term commitment to working together to help actually shape the way an enterprise orientation to generative AI, especially the one that OpenAI is making available to the world, might actually get utilized for the teaching and learning, the research, and the service missions of our universities and colleges. ASU, again, Rod, while you've shared with the audience, is well known for its innovation, prowess, if you will. It's substantively embedded in the ASU charter, which I want to just briefly sort of share, which is very much a commitment to inclusivity. We measure our success by who we include at ASU, not who we exclude. This is apropos Kelly's earlier comment, and actually how they succeed, how those students succeed. So at ASU, we have 200,000 students pursuing degrees. This year, next week, actually, the 100,000th student will actually receive a degree having studied at ASU online. More than 300 degree programs taught by our faculty. Next year, 100,000 students will actually enroll at ASU online. So ASU's commitment to a inclusive orientation at scale is a foundational commitment in our charter, as is our research commitment to research in the public interest and being socially embedded in the communities around us. And so substantively, when I began conversations with OpenAI, it was really seeing whether or not our missions were aligned. And actually, immediately, in fact, before we actually went out on our first date, it was actually the fact that our missions did align. There is a commitment at that research and development operation to be using the power and disruption of generative AI as a aspirational force for good at scale in an orientation to having global impact. And it's certainly aligned to our aspirations at ASU. And we have had a long track record of innovating with technology companies for the last 25 years to help them develop strategies for introducing their technologies into the higher education sector and to help shape it. And so that effectively in January is what we committed to doing. We actually helped develop the enterprise model for generative AI. Pre that, there was no way, at least an institution like ours or any represented today in the webinar, would have offered to use our intellectual property to help train the commercial products. We needed to have a garden wall orientation to that. The privacy and security of both our students and our research community is paramount. And so we needed to actually have technical ways of making sure that that also didn't bleed into the ways in which the big servers were scraping so much of the internet along the way. And then a whole host of new products that we've begun to introduce at ASU that we're doing, again, in a fully transparent way, not only with OpenAI, but with absolutely everyone in our sector, to actually begin to develop platform technologies to leverage that large language model, along with many other large language models, to actually create value for the teaching and learning mission, to the back office of the university. OpenAI, for example, really didn't have a go-to-market strategy for how to expose their APIs to support research activities. A theme maybe I'll pick up from Ray's and Kelly's point here. So ASU actually helped frame kind of how to make that happen along the way. And I think each of these technologies, going all the way back, in fact, even before Ray's note around the browser in the fall of '93, all the way back through to the origins of the internet, followed by the browser, followed by search, followed by mobile, followed by obviously now social and generative AI. All of them have origins in the research community, and all of them have gone through a period of commercialization. And the opportunity here is once again to help shape the way in which technologies that have been percolating in the labs for well over 60 years that are now being commercialized at a scale that only the private sector can actually generate will continue to be of service, and to establish more than just a rhetorical interest in the guardrails to support and make sure that bias, obviously privacy, and the ethical use, we call it principled innovation at ASU. All of that work is actually containerized so that we are hopefully going to make fewer errors and certainly try to advance the work to advance, in our case, our student success in this fashion. I'm happy as we carry the conversation forward, Rod, to answer any of the particulars. But this has really been an effort from the get-set. We did the same with Google many years ago when there was no Google Workspace or Google for Education product. We actually helped create the product for education. That this is sort of part of a journey that we've done before with Salesforce, with many other technology companies to help them introduce their products into the higher education marketplace. And in doing so, obviously trying to position ourselves, differentiate ourselves sometimes as first to market opportunity, but more than not, it's really around making sure that we leverage technology to afford us an opportunity to get to the scale that we aspire to do in the service of our charter, to make our education available to as many people across the full diversity of this country. We're the largest university in this country with respect to international students, students of First Nations, Aboriginal students in this country, and so forth. All of that is part of that same commitment.
Thank you, Ray. And before I launch into kind of the general questions, and I'll go in reverse, asking the panelists kind of in reverse. I'll start with Ray, and then I'll go to, I'll start with Lev, and then Ray, and then Kelly for this first question. But before I do that, you said something a second ago that actually struck a chord with me, was the accessibility tone of what ASU is doing, and perhaps the motivation behind all this. Reminds me a little bit of a recent book by Michael Smith, who talks about the scarcity of the university and how that needs to change. At the recent ASU and Global Silicon Valley Summit that happened April 14th until the 17th, one of the main themes that was in that space was talking about technology and education and regulation, which really gets to my first question for the panel. There's a lot to consider of scale and cost. A conversation I had with Saul Kahn, the cost of technology, scaling it to education is a big issue. It's a big issue for international efforts. It's perhaps an issue of consideration for what we're doing it here locally, right? So I'll start with Lev. In that space, what have been kind of the first entry points in terms of regulation policies, scalability of such efforts?
Well, the price per unit is going to continue to decline as it always has. The first set of release 1.0 of products is always going to be the most, not only the most expensive, but it's also going to be, if you will, the current version of Gen AI that we have is the worst version of Gen AI we're ever going to see into the future. Ray's reference to forthcoming ChatGPT 5.0, just in orders of magnitude, will be 100 times more powerful. The aspiration is to make it 100 times more accurate, and obviously 100 times more efficient. The price per unit already in the, again, let's remember, this is a startup, right? This entire industry as an industry is, literally just a couple of years old. And the price has already declined per unit over 70%. Now, what happened in storage, what happened in compute, what happened in network, all of those actually, there is right now, that 70% may sound like a rather radical decrease, but actually it's not. It will actually get much more significantly accessible in terms of cost per unit over the very near term. And I see that as something where we in higher education should continue to be the clarion call for why, in the public interest, this is got to be a significant motivator and outcome that should align us with the private sector, whilst they're obviously doing it mostly for a return on investment to their investors. This is not a case where those need to be in an orthogonal relationship to each other. We can definitely drive the value proposition, which we, again, at ASU, certainly one of the pieces and parts. And as we have conversations not only now with OpenAI, but with here in Arizona, the largest growth in semiconductor fabrication is here in the Southwest, in the Arizona area, with $40 billion of investment from NVIDIA, another $20 billion just about to start entering in the pipeline from them, and 2 huge semiconductor facilities from Intel here in the Valley as well. The cost of production of the GPUs, which currently defines the most significant input cost, those are also at the moment facing a scarcity model. In the relatively near future, that will level off, and in the mid to longer term, we will have an abundance model available, and that will drive down the cost, hopefully to a point where access will, over certainly the next 5 years, become a de minimis. The next 5 years, however, it's our job not to wait. It's our job to actually be pushing as hard as we can to make sure that the net positive effect of using technology to advance learning outcomes and its importance in terms of the social determinants of the wealth, well-being, and sustainability of our communities around the world. Those are the huge drivers.
Thank you for that, Lev. Ray, so, kind of picking up on what Lev just mentioned, and also picking up on the conversations that you and I had back in November 2023, we talked a little bit about the implications of institutional policies when it comes to governing AI. And really this, I guess, initial reaction was to kind of be concerned about, putting those guardrails in place. But from an UPCS standpoint, from a lifelong learning standpoint, from an adult education standpoint, how do we transcend transformation in this form of education? As Kelly mentioned, we've been doing micro-credentialing for a long time, but what does this mean for this endeavor when we mix technology like AI into this?
Well, certainly, as Lev was just saying, that we can't wait for a product to be fully developed and released at a price point that's affordable to a broad audience. We need to anticipate. So what we need to do is to begin to continue to work with the cutting edge of those technologies. We need to visualize what needs could be met if we had, and then you name it, the size, the number of processors, the size of the input that we can use our prompts for, or and the like. So in order to move forward, yes, we need guardrails, but you know what? Those change. The technology is changing, so we need to make them flexible and review them as necessary. I mean, one could say every 6 months, but it might be more often than that in some cases. We have to be logical about this, so we need a team. And one of the things I had suggested was that we had to create an AI strategy team. And I'm sure many universities have that, but that would include IT, certainly. But it would also include faculty across the curricula as well as students. And we have to focus on the long-term viability and impact, not on the short term. We've got to look down the line and establish policies that serve the end, what, our goal for the technology. That is, more diversity, more inclusion, broader audiences, international, developing countries. I mean, all of those I hear Lev saying, and I couldn't agree more that that should be a top priority for us. We have to emphasize ethical and privacy considerations as we look at these technologies, and we have to foster pilot programs that will give us a chance to try out these technologies without doing too much harm, but also to create the prospect of really developing something special. In order to do that, there are a lot of practical considerations, such as staff training, development. We have to, at the same time, we have to keep in mind what's going on at the international level. And, there are so many things that I know that Kelly's been engaged in UNESCO and others, other entities. So this is really a rather complex operation as we begin to find the best ways to use these technologies. But our focus has to be future-oriented. I suppose we take the oath of do no harm first, try not to do any harm, and then try to advance the opportunities for not just our students, but more broadly for industry, business, and the world as a whole. So, it's an audacious task, and happy that Lev is leading us in these considerations. And we all will follow, and in some cases may do something more advanced here and there to try to collectively raise the opportunities for the world.
Thank you, Ray. Ask you the kind of the most complex, question here, because, from a global perspective, the situation is complex. First of all, when it comes to regulating AI is like trying to regulate a utility. AI doesn't have a single purpose; it's multiple purposes, right? So that in itself is difficult. Another level of complexity is that the very models, the way that the models tokenize words, for example, in terms of making predictions, there is a cultural bias to that, linguistic bias. That sometimes English language works perfectly, for other languages doesn't work so well. And then there's also a matter of that, I was discussing with Lev, the matter of cost and scale. In parts of the world where UNESCO is embedded and trying to do work, transformative work, the biggest challenge is cost. The biggest challenge is that there isn't enough teachers, that although this technology could be transformative, how do we make it accessible? How do we ensure that all these other concerns are minimized? Like I said, it's a complex question, but let's see what you can do with that.
Yes. So I have the rest of the time, right? I'm just kidding. So I think that there are a few things that I would like to put on the table, both in response to this question and in response to the previous speakers. I would say that commercialization is one means to scale. It's not the only means to scale, but it is the most prevalent, particularly in the OECD countries. It is typically the least equitable and most likely in these contexts, this idea of kind of the market taking things to scale. And when you look at a country that's not in the OECD, you see different types of access gaps emerging. There's a no access situation, which can be driven by infrastructure or cost. And if it's driven by infrastructure, you need public-private partnerships, international cooperation, you need Vodacom basically to come in and help you out. And then if it's a cost issue, you need things like targeted subsidies or sliding scale charge structures where people who can pay more do pay more, and people who can pay less pay less. We typically see the opposite emerge, where people with lower income are typically asked to pay more per unit because of different kind of back end calculations that take place in terms of what's required in each transaction and so on and so forth. Then you have kind of limited access situations where you can deal with it through incentives, campaigns, public-private partnerships, social supports like libraries, net cafes, and maybe targeted supports to certain types of businesses that particularly enable access to certain types of technology, things like that. And when you get to like a full access situation, that's when you start thinking about, and I'm not saying this is how it should be, I'm just saying this is what I see. That's when people start talking about, wait, are we using these technologies responsibly? Are our regulations adequate to the task? And I think that while it may be true that the technologies are going to change, the parameters through which we judge a technology probably are a little bit more immutable. Is it safe? Is it transparent? Is it effective? Is it fair? Are people accountable? Have we protected human agency? These are all questions that are going to emerge no matter how technology changes. And so regulations need to respond not to specific technologies themselves, but rather to the overall framing of how, as a society, we want to leverage technology for good and what's required to do that. So I don't think that it's as inflexible or as flexible rather. I think there are some things that are relatively inflexible. Sorry, apologies on that. The other thing I think I really want to emphasize here is around efficacy, right? So is it effective is a really important metric. And I had a conversation just a few weeks ago as part of our network efforts with education technologists who are working in AI and working across different spaces and trying to pursue, the holy grail of kind of innovative pedagogy that transforms learner outcomes. And, the more market-driven companies, some of them said straight out that actually they've moved away from that in some ways because it's so difficult, and it's difficult to prove, and it's difficult to get buy-in, and it's difficult to get market share. Whereas if you target something like, an automatic grading tool or something like this that helps teachers to improve their efficiencies, it's much easier. It's a much softer entry. So I think we're going to see things like that continue to emerge in the conversation of how and when and why we integrate artificial intelligence into our pedagogies. And I'm speaking particularly about pedagogies here. And I think the other important thing is we can talk about the cost per unit. And I realize that, we're talking about the cost per unit in terms of producing technology going down. We also need to consider value though, right? So if the cost of an intervention decreases, and I'm not so much speaking about the technology as I am its application, right? So if we're using artificial intelligence to replace teachers, for example, we have to be very cognizant about, is there a value trade-off in that? And what is the relationship between increasing uses of artificial intelligence to drive instruction and the quality of the instruction that we're able to offer? And unfortunately, a lot of times this takes a back seat actually, because approaches to artificial intelligence aren't sufficiently science-backed. We know a lot about how people learn now. We know a lot about how the brain works. And we tend to have a more siloed approach than we should. So in response to Lev's comment on the antagonistic relationship, we can't have an antagonistic relationship. We really need technology developers to value educationalists and scientists who work on things like how people learn, so the science of learning. And we really need, on the other hand, for people in academia who are really doing the research, to Ray's earlier point, the research is ongoing. We're learning things all the time. So we need technologists to be willing to integrate those types of principles and ensure that, at least in theory, their interventions are going to be pedagogically sound and they are going to make a difference to the outcomes in learning environments. And then even beyond that, I would say that another big piece that we really need to work on in the global community is differentiating what we mean by evidence. You can generate evidence in a sandbox or a testing bed quite easily, but what we really need to know as a community is what works for who and under what conditions. So it's about these large scale applications. You know, if you have 200,000 students, that's fantastic, because maybe you could use AI to pick up some kind of innovative ways of measuring things like student engagement or student interest, and we can start unpacking things in new and different ways than just saying, on average, we increase things by 0.2 standard deviations and therefore consider this a successful intervention, you know. So these are my, I suppose, parting shots around the application of AI in a worldwide context. Thank you.
Thanks,
Hey,
Kelly. And I
Rod,
think-
if
Yeah,
I
go
could,
ahead.
yeah, maybe just a quick conversation around this. So, you know, at ASU, the good news is the community as a whole, outside of ASU, has a chance to obviously both observe what we're doing and also assess whether what we're doing is relevant to the world outside of ASU. 2,200 faculty have volunteered on their own to actually take an 8-course sequence or an 8-module sequence on using AI for teaching and learning. We have today the largest business school in the country, which is WP Carey, 28,000 students, has 2 degrees, an undergraduate and a graduate degree on AI for business. The law school, the social work school, each one of them is in play. And we have literally over 400 GPTs that faculty have created along the way with guidance from our AI acceleration team in my shop. We have a great collaboration with a group which we call our Learning Engineering Institute, which is really an assessment team that takes a look at the deployment, along with a group called the Action Lab in our online learning environment. And so what the great news is, because again, we don't have proprietary interest in what we're doing, we continue to share openly, our journey along the way. Wonderful petri dish for people to come in and take a look at. And again, everyone is most welcome, not just to read or watch what we do, but to spend time with us along, for the next couple of years as this work continues to move forward.
Well, I'd love to take you up on that. I mean, I'm really fascinated and I'd love to see how it all goes.
That's great. So I think, this raises a couple of really interesting points. One of them is, I think I'd like to go back to a comment that Mike Sharples, my previous guest, said that he had a fun game a number of years ago where he was trying to predict what would happen in the next 25 years, right? So him and a number of his colleague scholars were trying to do that. Nowhere near perfect, but they were able to get pretty close in terms of technological advancements within 25 years. Now, not perfect, but pretty close. Here's what they found, though. 25 years down the road, trying to predict changes within higher education, nowhere near that. So in some ways, Lev, maybe ASU is the anomaly here. I mean, I heard you say earlier that they really transformative work that had gone on with Google, perhaps transformative work that's going on with OpenAI. But here's $1 million question. So I had to ask each of you, right, this next question: where do you see, not where do you predict, but where do you see the change required within what institutions need to do? And I'm going to make this a little easy for the context of Kelly, and maybe let's pertain this within the North American context, the US Canadian context for now, not to make it too complicated. But what do we need to do as institutions to begin to move the needle, to really utilize technology to harness accessibility, to reduce those barriers? And I'm going to start that question off. I'm going to kind of throw it back to Kelly and then go to Lev and then go to Ray.
Wow, I think it's all about data and cooperation, to be completely honest with you. I think it speaks to my last point. We do need still a better understanding of what works for whom, under what conditions, different types of engagement. And we know that engagement strategies are changing, right? So the interests of each generation are not the same as ours, you know? And so I think that I'm really excited. I mean, let me just put it this way. I'm really excited about initiatives that look to share data across institutions to create interoperable structures, particularly between EdTech products, that will enable us to start looking at broader pools of data in new and innovative ways as researchers. So I think that is certainly one thing. I also think a lot of what ASU is doing is probably spot on the mark. I mean, if we can increase accessibility within institutions, of course, my ideal is between institutions as well, that idea of credential mobility, but at least broadening the pool, increasing the number of seats, focusing on equity, even in the face of legislation against equity, I think these are the keys to our future.
Thanks, Kelly. Lev.
Well, Generation Alpha is going to be our Gen AI generation. Those are folks who are today 15 years old or so, starting 15 years of age. And as they enter the world of higher education, they're only going to know Gen AI. And it'll be very interesting to see what evolves. And to answer your question, Rod, I think the single biggest challenge that we have institutionally to grapple with is what does it mean to assess learning in an AI generation, in an AI era? When so much of our relationship to the machine and to each other as humans is going to necessarily evolve outside of the world of higher education. How do we assess learning, competencies, skills, relevant ways that we need to evolve to support the needs of our communities, the social, the economic needs of our communities, all the things that for in many ways have evolved over the first, if you will, 50 years of the internet revolution. But as Ray indicated, this may be a step function different. This may actually require us to be thinking for Generation Alpha about a very different way to assess learning outcomes. And I hope again, that actually we are up to the task rather than simply settling for an incremental orientation to it. That will be our institutional view, that it is, again, a chance to simply evolve in incremental fashion. I do think in terms of the broader challenges facing us as a species, it probably incremental is not good enough. I think we need to be able to actually create knowledge in a way that leverages AI to address the multifold complexities of living in the 21st century, and as a result, harnessing AI for what it could do to help solve for and be a partner with both creative partner and science partner. This is a great opportunity in front of us.
Thanks, Lev. And I'm noticing in the chat, there's a number of questions coming forward saying, how does one contact ASU to learn more about what you're doing? So Lev, is there a quick way that people can learn a little bit more about what ASU is doing?
By all means, yes. Simply go to ai.asu.edu. It's a complete open book. Everything that we're doing, all the research, all the assessment, all the engagement, all the technology, all available there.
Thank you. Ray, I'm going to go back to a question that you and I talked about a little bit when we met in November, and that is kind of this preoccupation with plagiarism. And I'm going to pose a question that maybe is going to be a difficult question to answer briefly, but there seems to be two camps in this idea, right? There is kind of recent papers by some philosophers who is talking about the connection between oral learning, written learning, and its connection to thinking and the importance to preserve that. Other camps, and I'll cite Mario Carpo, who is architect and a philosopher of sorts, who says that creativity requires precedence. Creativity requires precedence. In other words, we build on, we are inspired by, we work on, we are influenced by the past, right? So this preoccupation with plagiarism, which is a very interesting discourse, where do you think that needs to go within higher education and the use of AI, in particular?
That's a great question. I'm going to pause that for just 15 seconds to respond to Lev, that I think we really are looking at a need for a broad, authentic assessment, that now there are so many interrelated aspects that come into our teaching and learning that it's no longer an ABC, it's no longer memorization. It's, the computer is our extended memory. It's authentic assessment. It's applying these in your work, in your teaching, and in life. But now, specifically, as we look at plagiarism, I think that was an early and naive flare up at the beginning of the release of this technology. I think we need to look at copyright once again in broader terms. We need to recognize when thoughts come from others. And that's what we need to emphasize, not necessarily the MLA style or what, APA style. It's not that. It is that we just have to acknowledge that others gave us ideas along the way. And just as you, Rod, have mentioned, where a lot of these thoughts have come from that prompt the questions that you've shared with us, we need to do that. I think plagiarism needs to be put in a context of a new and different and broader assessment of copyright. That copyright needs to be looked at more broadly, and it is instead, we need to nod to and give a link to individuals that have provided us broadly with information. But I think the plagiarism is just so minuscule. It is a cultural change, and perhaps it's Gen Alpha, my grandson, who I'll see is bringing these new approaches to us, and you see that reflected in many of those of that generation. It's to give recognition. It's only fair, but the whole idea is that we take what we've learned and we mold it and apply it to today and to the future, and that's the natural process.
Thank you, Ray. I would encourage. I mean, you threw out something about copyright. For those interested in this topic, there's a great book called "Who Owns This Sentence." Go out and read it. Fascinating history on the whole copyright thing. This is a last quick one by answer from the three of you. But before I do that, I'd like to address one question that was put in chat about, it says, how do you think AI can be used with people with learning disabilities or any other kind of disability? You may answer that, but I'm going to just kind of interject to say that there was a great quote by Stephen Hawking that really did talk about the ability, his intellectual ability was augmented through technology, that he was able to communicate. He was able to do a lot of things with the use of technology. This is well before the current conversations in the context of AI enabling. So I think that, we cannot forget the potentials here. We cannot, and this is why there is such a preoccupation with the perils, is because there's so much potential. There's so much good that could come out of this, but we just need to have those guardrails in place. All right. Here's my quick bite response. The one thing that excites you, right, which is kind of related to what I said earlier, but the one thing that excites you about where this is all going, what would that be, right? So I'm going to start with Ray, go to Kelly, and then wrap up with Lev. Ray.
Access to learning. It really is so exciting. And this motivated me way back in the 90s with online learning. This is on steroids. So much, so much inflated is that we will be able to provide access to everyone in the world. And quality opportunities to knowledge, to information, and the opportunity to learn. I would add briefly that learning disabilities, that this technology, that is generally technology, computer technology, is able to reformat and to provide learning in ways that are effective for those who have disabilities. So I am very optimistic.
Thank you, Ray. Kelly.
I'm going to come a bit out of left field maybe, but I'm going to say that what excites me the most is the opportunity to think more deeply about what it means to be human and what our interactions actually look like and what intelligence is even and human agency. These types of conversations that have been ongoing are very exciting to me. And I think that they are going to lead us to a deeper understanding of ourselves as a society and as individuals. I mean, just one example on the plagiarism front. If you compare ChatGPT to Wikipedia, when Wikipedia came out, there was this kind of en masse just like discussion and then decision that no, you can't use it as a reference academically. But ChatGPT, we're kind of leaning the other way. Like, yeah, you can. So what is this? Individuals inputting content can't be trusted, but people en masse can, when filtered through AI. And so these sorts of debates really, really excite me. And yeah, I think we're headed to a really interesting future.
Thanks, Kelly. Lev.
Well, I think growth and access combined with equity and inclusion. That is the challenge no matter where we are in the world. The opportunity is for those of us in multiple generations and those of us who stand on the shoulders of those who've come before us, this has always been the grand aspiration of why education is a journey and not necessarily just a destination. Taking essentially as our mission, our calling to leverage all of the tools, including the technological tools that are there to achieve those goals. And I have to say, I want to double click on Kelly's very well articulated statement. In the end, this is actually all about us as humans. Being human in the age of AI will be one of the most central questions for us to evolve, grapple, debate, and creatively solve for.
Very well said. Well, thank you, everyone. I think that as we wrap things up, I'd like to maybe just say just a couple of comments. One of the things that really excites me about all this, and I've been, involved in the space, reading about it, thinking about it, and trying to implement ideas in the last couple of years. What fascinates me is not the technology. What fascinates me are the conversations, is the philosophical discourse. It's the idea that we can talk about cognition and thinking and what it means to be human. And I think that much like the conversations around micro-credentials, which not about the credentials, but about what it means to learn, what is authentic learning, all of those things are so important that we need to have that discourse. We need to continue those dialogues. With that said, I'd like to thank all those who I've interviewed in the past, but in particular, I'd like to thank Ray, I'd like to thank Lev, I'd like to thank Kelly for your willingness. Each of you specifically answered my emails in super short order, right? And a willingness to share your expertise, a willingness to share your ideas with others. And I truly thank you. I think all of you, I'm just thinking Lev, the most recent, I emailed him on a Thursday afternoon at 2:30. He emails me back, yep, let's do it. That was it. I'm like, oh, awesome. And again, I think that really says a lot about the three of you and about my other guests as well. I think this idea to foster intellectual discourse is so important in this day and age. Thank you so much. And thank you for our attendees who have come here and listened to this important conversation. And now I hand things over to Karen. Thanks, Karen.
Thanks so much, Rod. And on behalf of the division, I'd really like to extend our sincere appreciation to all of our panel members for your insights today. That was really a fantastic conversation and a great way to end our webinar series. So On behalf of the Division of Extended Education at the University of Manitoba, as Rod said, we'd like to express our gratitude to all of our webinar participants for joining us today and throughout the series. And I'd like to invite each of you to share your thoughts and feedbacks with us through a brief survey that you'll receive shortly after this webinar. And please be sure to visit the Extended Education website for information on a wide array of our programs, as well as future webinar offerings. This officially concludes our webinar series. I'd like to acknowledge Rod for his vision and incredible work on developing and moderating this entire webinar series. It's been a great conversation from day one. And thank you again to all of the panelists who have contributed and participated throughout the series. Thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a wonderful day.